we somehow take on the guilt on ourselves. Why did we do something about it? Now the Dalai Lama, with all his philosophy and Buddhism, I just wonder, how does he deal with guilt? Does he feel any guilt about possibly some things that he may or may not have done during the time, during, all those things that happened in Tibet? Or has he gone beyond even feeling guilt?
What a good question. I'm certainly not in a position to answer that. I do know he feels a great, great sense of responsibility, certainly for the present and the future, but no doubt for the past too. As I say, his tendency is not to think about the past because he sees that as wasteful. That's not a good use of his time. But there may be things that now he wishes he had done differently. Recently, in the last year, he's been talking a lot about his meetings with Mao Zedong. As many of you may know, when he was 19 years old, he went over the protests of his concerned people to spend a year in China and many months in Beijing to get to know Mao Zedong, because he believed it was much better to make that human contact rather than just to communicate through emissaries and from afar. And he's talked a lot about how warmed and moved he was by Mao Zedong, and how Mao Zedong treated him as a father might a son, and at banquets Mao Zedong would feed him with his own chopsticks, and Mao Zedong was really a mentor to him in many ways. And to the point where the Dalai Lama said that he wanted to join the Communist Party, and that he was very sympathetic to many of the ideas of equality that Marxism was promoting. And then famously, just before he left Beijing, he had that conversation with Mao Zedong, and Mao was as avuncular as he had been before, but said, well, religion is poison. And as soon as the Dalai Lama heard that, he realized, well, this is the man who's come to destroy my culture and my tradition. And I think when he says that, he's also saying that to some extent he had been taken in, or he had been more credulous than he should have been. He was a 19-year-old meeting this already very distinguished statesman, and probably he didn't read that Mao Zedong as clearly as he would have liked to. And I'm sure there are other things he did in his early years because he knew so little about the world, and because he was forced prematurely to take political power over his people at the age of 15 rather than 18. I think he would be the first person to say, A, that he's imperfect, and B, that he was ignorant, and that ignorance leads to wrong judgments often. I don't think guilt is particularly his thing, and I don't think even wistfulness is. But I think looking closely at your mistakes and trying to learn from them is definitely one. And he's made many public mistakes, and sometimes he's decided maybe not to learn from them. Some of you know the Aum Shinrikyo terrorist attack in the Tokyo subway system in 1995. There was a somewhat dubious quasi-Buddhist cult that actually started passing poison around amidst the Japanese populace. And the Dalai Lama had actually endorsed the leader of that, because he believes he's always trying to encourage people. And when he first met that man, he was so impressed by the man's humility and the fact that tears came to his eyes when he spoke about Buddhism, that the Dalai Lama endorsed that man. And then 2 years later, the Dalai Lama was in a difficult situation because that man had his leaders commit this terrorist attack. That said, if a somewhat dubious leader approaches the Dalai Lama now, the Dalai Lama probably still opens his door to him, because that's he believes in trust, and he believes in contact over the opposite. So there are some mistakes where he probably says, I'm happy to make them because the alternative is even worse. To close my door to those people would actually harm myself as well as them. But thank you. As you can tell, I don't have a definitive answer.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
My question is almost a follow-up to the previous question. When the problems in Tibet occurred, I was in college, and the feeling at that time in India was India should have done something about it. And the answer was, Dalai Lama said, we don't want any force. I mean, this is what we heard. And visiting Tibet 4 years ago, you are absolutely right. It's isolated. People are far away. Now, what is the message that Dalai Lama has for the people of Tibet today? Because I see them living 2 centuries behind.
Yes.
There's a lot of influence of China rapidly gaining there.
Yes.
So what does he have as a message to his own people?
I think it is to learn as much as possible from the Chinese, to rejoice in China's material development. He always says that all Tibetans are glad that they're a part of China, and that their lives are much better, thanks to China genuinely having made them less isolated, as you were saying, and brought all these much needed material facilities. And I think he always tells them to think of the Chinese as brothers and sisters, while also not losing their Tibetan heritage and language and religion. And my experience, I first visited Tibet, as I mentioned, in the early 80s, and my most recent visit was 2002. And in that 17-year span, I actually found that the Tibetans, in Lhasa at least, were more devoted to the Dalai Lama and more devoted to Tibetan Buddhism than before, perhaps because of all the pressures to relinquish that. But I think the main thing he always is telling them is to be part of this larger identity, not to cut themselves off from the Chinese, and not to give up hope, and not to feel that Tibetan heritage is a lost cause. And it's so interesting, I'd never heard that story about his saying no violence, but it rings very true. And I know, the real predicament of exile Tibet right now, and maybe of Tibetans in Tibet too, is that the Dalai Lama takes this very clear-sighted vision that's looking to what may happen in the 22nd century. And most Tibetans say, well, we can't wait that long. We're human beings. We're not monks. We're not incarnate lamas. We want a better life for our children, and we don't want to wait 100 years. And so I've heard a lot of exiled Tibetans in Tibet going over India's treatment to Tibet and the various Indian leaders, some of whom were more sympathetic to Tibetan cause and some of whom were less. I think the Dalai Lama never does that. And he writes very interestingly about Nehru in his autobiography, as you probably know. But there is that increasing distance, really, between him always holding to the high road of peace and forgiveness, and his people finding it harder and harder in a human way to do that. You probably know that there was a Tibetan guerrilla movement right up into the 1970s, funded by the CIA and based in Nepal. And as soon as our country achieved détente with China, and Nepal really decided to become an ally of China's, the Dalai Lama realized that that movement had to stop. So he sent a tape-recorded message to the guerrillas saying, put down your arms, please never pick them up again. And some of them were so heartbroken that they actually committed suicide. All of them listened to the Dalai Lama, but they were so upset at not being able to prosecute their cause for independence that they took their own lives. Maybe we should have one more question, because that's such a gloomy note on which to end. Good, there's somebody at the very back.
I have a student I would like to go to.
Go
ahead. One and then...
Yeah. Mr. Iyer, it was again quite sad to see Mr. Dalai Lama saying on television in the last 2 weeks that he has failed.
Yes.
And I do not know if you had any opportunity of talking with him in the last 2 weeks, but next time when you get your opportunity, please convey to him it's not lost. There are people around the world who have much hope even after he leaves this world.
Thank you. And I'd just like to say, brief postscript to that. I just wrote a long article. It felt like a book to people who were reading it. A long article in the New York Review of Books last month about his saying that he'd failed. And he was saying that a lot when I saw him last November, and trying to put that in a context. And I think there are two reasons for that. The main one is, I think he's trying to galvanize his people to act, because he wants to ease his people into taking full authority for themselves while he's still alive, rather than his suddenly dying a few years from now and his people feeling they're totally rudderless and helpless. So he's almost pushing them, forcing them to take the reins. And he just held, so he's been stressing over and over, my policies failed, please fellow Tibetans, come up with a new policy. Which is a way of training them while he can be around to help them in their development. So I think that's one strategic reason within his own community. And I think the other reason is just the reports he's been hearing from Tibet in the last 13 months are so shocking and so heartbreaking, of arrests and beatings and much stronger oppression than in recent years, that I think he's trying to convey a message to the world, to try to go to Tibet if possible and bring back hard evidence of what's really going on, since a black curtain has fallen around it. and he's trying to tell the